Neil Armstrong, the most famous American astronaut, was the first person to walk on the moon.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But how did Armstrong become an astronaut? And why was he the first man to step onto the moon? From a young age, Armstrong was fascinated by planes and by flight. He went on to study aeronautical engineering at Purdue University on a U.S. Navy scholarship. His studies were interrupted by the Korean War, during which Armstrong flew 78 combat missions for the U.S. Navy. In 1955, after he had graduated from college with a degree in aeronautical engineering, Armstrong joined NASA and became a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in California. He was now en route to taking a place in history. It wasn't all plain sailing. While training for his first space flight, something went badly wrong. Armstrong, with a reputation for always being calm and collected, was able to escape just before the craft exploded. He was developing skills he'd need as an astronaut. In 1966, he piloted the Gemini 8 mission. This was the first successful docking in space, a sign of future projects. It was this buildup of experience that led to Armstrong being chosen to command the Apollo 11 mission, a mission with one gigantic aim: to land on the moon. On July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 astronauts blasted off from Cape Kennedy, Florida. It took Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins 4 days to travel the 239,000 miles to the moon. As the lunar module approached its planned landing spot, it became clear the area was full of large boulders. Fuel was low and time was short, but once again, Armstrong kept a cool head. He took control of the spacecraft's computer and skimmed across the lunar surface to make a soft landing.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
While Michael Collins remained in lunar orbit in the service module Columbia, Armstrong and Aldrin collected moon rocks, conducted experiments, planted an American flag, and left behind boot prints that are still on the moon today. On their successful return to Earth, the astronauts were greeted as heroes and awarded many medals. But Armstrong, always the reluctant hero, now decided to back away from the limelight. He remained at NASA for a time, but not in the astronauts program, and he subsequently left to teach aeronautical engineering at the University of Cincinnati. Armstrong rarely spoke of his great mission. He eventually retired to a farm in Ohio, where he carried on his love of flying and adventure. Armstrong died in September 2012 at the age of 82. His achievement, those small steps on the moon, will be remembered as one of the greatest feats of exploration.
After people had looked up for tens of thousands of years and wondered what was up there, Neil was the first person to ever make a footprint on some place other than Earth. I told Neil once that I'm not a very jealous person, but for him I'll make an exception on that one. That first step on the moon was really something.
The Apollo project was a series of space missions with one aim: to get an American astronaut on the moon. It was run by NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and lasted for 9 years, from 1963 to 1972. NASA had already been doing research into whether humans could possibly survive in space for 10 years before that, as part of Project Mercury. But the US was not the only country on that trail. In 1957, the Soviet or Russian space program launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The US regarded this as serious competition, dubbed the space race. Who would get a human into orbit first, the Americans or the Russians? It was, in fact, to be the Russians who made the breakthrough, with Yuri Gagarin becoming the first man in space in the spring of 1961. It was just 1 month ahead of the first US manned spaceflight, with astronaut Alan Shepard. America was determined to win the next phase of the space race, the race to the moon. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
Apollo was going to be a different kind of mission from anything the world had ever seen, using bigger rockets and more powerful technology. Apollo was designed as a 3-part spacecraft: the command module, where the crew would live, the service module, to power the spacecraft, and the lunar module, a separate part which could break off, land on the moon's surface, and then bring astronauts back to the orbiting craft. But it took 7 years of tests and trials before the first manned mission to the moon. Apollo 8 orbited the moon on Christmas Eve 1968 and then came back to Earth, proving that the journey was possible. The historic moment came 7 months later in 1969. Commanded by Neil Armstrong, with Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, as well as TV cameras to send pictures back home, Apollo 11 set out to achieve President Kennedy's ambitious goal. Collins remained in the command module, while Armstrong and Aldrin left the spacecraft in the lunar module to land on the moon.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong took those famous, courageous steps.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
After the success of the moon landing, there were 6 more Apollo missions. Apollo 13 is famous because of a dramatic but successful rescue. 2 days after its launch in 1970, an explosion cut off the oxygen in the crew's quarters. The astronauts had to abandon the mission and use the lunar module as a kind of life raft, while Mission Control, back in Houston, worked frantically to get them home. The last flight to the moon was Apollo 17 in 1972. The spacecraft had a bigger payload, which meant the astronauts could collect more moon rock samples to bring home. The Apollo project was a huge technological achievement, not only for the United States, but it paved the way for collaborative partnerships in space, such as the Apollo-Soyuz project.
When we opened hatch in space, we were opening back on the Earth an era in the history of man.
Instead of racing against each other, the Americans and Russians were working together on a new venture, the International Space Station. A total of 12 astronauts walked on the surface of the moon during the Apollo project. They conducted scientific research, studied the lunar surface, and collected moon rocks to bring back to Earth. They also took the first clear photographs of the Earth from space. Small, fragile, and peaceful. These images are a reminder of the vastness of outer space and the desire to explore the unknown.